Spring in Spokane carried a quiet kind of promise, the kind that made lawns greener, skies wider, and dreams feel plausible. Claire and Jason West had just moved into their first home together, a modest craftsman-style house tucked at the edge of a sleepy residential street. Claire, 29, worked as a school psychologist and had a quiet resilience about her, shaped by years of listening, absorbing, and holding space for others. Jason, 2 years older, was an architect with a growing reputation and a warm, thoughtful demeanor. Their new home had a small garden that caught the morning sun and a second bedroom they affectionately called the future nursery, though they hadn't yet spoken seriously about children. At first, everything felt right. They spent evenings unpacking boxes, arguing playfully over furniture placement, planting basil and tomatoes in the backyard. The silence of the neighborhood was punctuated only by birdsong and the distant sound of lawnmowers. It felt like a chapter beginning, written in clean margins. But the peace didn't last long. Margaret, Jason's mother, began appearing more and more frequently. She'd always been a presence in his life, but now she hovered like a shadow that refused to recede. Her visits started with casseroles and ended in critiques. She would sweep through the house with a smile that never quite touched her eyes, her gaze darting from the unpolished silverware to the mismatched dish towels. At first, Claire dismissed it as nerves, a mother adjusting to her son's independence, but the pattern became harder to ignore. Margaret commented on the curtains Claire had chosen, too dark for spring. She questioned the nutrition value of the dinners Claire prepared, suggesting simpler options Jason had always liked. She replaced towels without asking, rearranged spices in the kitchen, left parenting books on the coffee table. She arrived unannounced, claiming she was just in the neighborhood, though Claire doubted the coincidence every time. Jason brushed off the tension with casual shrugs. "She means well," he would say, tugging Claire into a side hug before heading back to work on a design project. But Claire felt it tightening around her like thread, this presence that insinuated, that smiled while subtly reshaping everything around her. There was no fight, no raised voice, only a creeping sense of displacement. Claire began to feel like a guest in her own home, a visitor in the life she had helped build. Every time she left a room, she wondered what Margaret would critique next. Every shared dinner felt like a silent contest she hadn't agreed to enter. Claire didn't want to be suspicious or bitter, but beneath Margaret's tidy gestures lurked something unspoken. Control masked as care, possession dressed as concern. The house, once a blank page for new beginnings, now held echoes of an older voice. Claire felt it in the way she second-guessed her choices, in the chill that entered when the doorbell rang, in the smile she practiced in the mirror before every Sunday visit. What was supposed to be a home had started to feel like a battleground, one where no weapons were visible, but every silence cut deeper than words. Summer brought longer days and the illusion of warmth, but inside Claire and Jason's home, the temperature grew colder. The air between them shifted, slowly, imperceptibly at first, like a draft you don't feel until it's already under your skin. Margaret's presence, once confined to uninvited visits and judgmental smiles, became something more insidious. Her influence no longer hovered at the edges, it began to seep into the very foundation of their marriage. Jason started meeting his mother for dinner, just the two of them. At first, it seemed harmless, even thoughtful. He called it catching up, saying she missed him, needed advice about some minor home repair, wanted to talk about the house she was thinking of selling. But the frequency of these dinners grew, and Claire noticed the changes they left behind. Jason returned from them quiet, reflective, his gaze distant even when he smiled. He became quicker to anger, slower to laugh. Little things, forgotten chores, offhand comments, turned into full-blown arguments. It was as if someone had pressed a wedge between them and kept tapping it in deeper, one fraction of an inch at a time. Claire suspected, but couldn't prove. Then came the small confirmations, drips of poison. Jason began parroting phrases that didn't sound like him. He asked if she was absolutely sure she wanted children, even though they'd already discussed it, and both agreed to wait a year or two. He wondered aloud if her job was too emotionally draining to allow space for a family. He mentioned, almost absently, that she had been forgetful lately, a story Margaret had supposedly shared about a missed appointment that Claire knew never happened. The words weren't confrontational, just casual, uncertain, little seeds of doubt that clung to everything. He started staying late at the office more often. His phone calls were shorter, his texts more clipped. The warmth in his voice faded. Claire watched it happen like someone observing a painting being slowly washed away by rain. Each day, less definition, less color. She tried to reach him, asked if something was wrong, if work was too much, if he felt tired. He answered with shrugs, with kisses that felt obligatory, with the kind of silence that came not from peace, but from disconnection. One morning, while wiping down the kitchen counter, Claire noticed a card tucked between cookbooks. It was a business card for a family therapist. Handwritten on the back in careful script was Jason's name, and beneath it, suggested Margaret. Claire stared at it, the weight of the moment settling heavily in her chest. She turned it over again and again, trying to believe it wasn't what it looked like. But it was. It explained too much. She didn't confront him right away. Instead, she sat with the card for hours, then days, hiding it in her nightstand as if proximity would give her clarity. But the clarity never came. Only fear. For the first time, Claire truly understood what was happening. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a personality clash. Something was being eroded from the inside. Her marriage was no longer between her and Jason. It had become a quiet war, and Margaret had already breached the walls. Claire felt it in her chest, that crushing pressure of helplessness. Something sacred was slipping through her fingers, not all at once, but in drops. Not through betrayal loud and obvious, but through whispers, doubts, and careful manipulation. She saw now that the danger wasn't noise, it was silence. Not confrontation, but corrosion. The house they had built together still stood, but its beams were groaning under the weight of something neither of them wanted to name. Autumn arrived with a heavy stillness that settled over the house like fog. The leaves turned amber and red outside their windows, but inside, everything remained muted. Conversations clipped, routines mechanical, intimacy absent. Claire, worn thin by the silence and by the constant sense of being tested and watched, suggested therapy. Her voice trembled slightly when she brought it up, expecting resistance. To her surprise, Jason agreed, though the nod he gave her carried no conviction, only exhaustion. It was not a step forward, it was a quiet surrender. They attended weekly sessions at a small, warmly lit office downtown. The space smelled faintly of citrus and books, and the therapist, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and an unreadable expression, welcomed them with professional calm. Claire spoke, at first hesitantly, then with urgency. She described the disconnection, the changes in Jason, the coldness that had replaced their shared life. She tried to explain what it felt like to live with someone who was there physically, but absent in every other way. Jason, in contrast, said very little. He sat back with his arms folded or his hands in his lap, offering short answers or vague comments. He didn't refute what Claire said, but neither did he validate it. His passivity made her feel increasingly exposed, like a voice echoing down a long, empty hallway. The therapist didn't push him. In fact, Claire began to notice something strange. The counselor often nodded at Jason's quiet moments, offering him affirming glances, occasionally redirecting Claire when her words became too emotional. At first, Claire doubted her instincts, but then came the detail that made everything fall into place. A framed photo on the shelf behind the therapist's desk, a community fundraiser from years ago. Margaret stood in the center, arm in arm with the very woman guiding their sessions. Claire left their fourth session with a hollow in her chest. On the car ride home, Jason said nothing. He tapped at his phone while she stared out the window, the weight of everything pressing inward. That night, she sat at the kitchen table long after he went to bed. She stared at her untouched tea and thought about how truth, when it hides, becomes something poisonous. If it wouldn't come forward on its own, she would find a way to pull it out. In the following days, Claire reached out to her oldest friend, Hannah, a former theater student turned digital creative. Together, they built a persona. Madeline Rose, a certified women's empowerment coach with a soothing tone and a growing online presence. The profile looked real enough. Soft pastels, inspirational quotes, testimonials carefully fabricated to appeal to someone like Margaret. They followed Margaret's public account, slowly liking, commenting, reaching out. Within a week, Margaret responded. It started with small talk, self-care routines, boundaries in marriage, the challenges of adult children growing distant. Claire, posing as Madeline, carefully crafted her replies. She created a digital space that felt warm, safe, and validating. Margaret leaned into it. She messaged at all hours, unloading her frustrations about Claire, complaining that her son was becoming someone else, sharing how she'd had to guide him back with little corrections here and there. Claire read every word with growing disbelief. Margaret bragged about warning Jason of Claire's emotional instability, about exaggerating stories to keep him cautious. She admitted to forwarding altered screenshots of Claire's texts, presenting them out of context, twisting their meaning. She hinted at things she'd said to Jason that made him question Claire's readiness for children, her honesty, even her mental health. Claire saved everything: screenshots, voice notes, timestamps. Each message was a drop of acid burning through the mask Margaret had so carefully constructed. There was no remorse in her tone, only pride. She described it as protection, as preserving the bond between mother and son. But Claire saw it clearly now. It was sabotage disguised as love. It was manipulation executed with elegance. As the days passed, the plan took shape in Claire's mind. She wasn't sure how or when, but she knew this. The truth would come to light, and when it did, it would speak in Margaret's own words. Claire worked with quiet precision, gathering the pieces like a meticulous archivist. Over the course of weeks, she compiled every message, every audio fragment, every damning phrase Margaret had uttered while believing she was speaking to a trusted confidant. The folder grew thick with digital evidence, screenshots annotated with timestamps, audio files neatly labeled, voice memos transcribed and highlighted. She organized it all into a private dossier, methodical and clean. There were no angry notes, no emotional outbursts, just facts, patterns, proof. She didn't want revenge. Not really. What she wanted was clarity, for Jason to see what she had endured, not through her eyes, but through his mother's own words. She wanted the fog to lift, the spell to break. But she knew that confronting him directly would only push him deeper into denial. He needed to discover it as truth, not accusation. So she chose her moment carefully. Their wedding anniversary approached, and with it came a dinner organized by Margaret. As expected, it was hosted at the family's favorite restaurant: white tablecloths, dim lighting, too many forks. The entire West clan gathered, cheerful and coordinated. Margaret wore pale lavender and a smile as polished as the silverware. Jason looked distracted, distant, his hand resting lightly on Claire's shoulder without weight. She had rehearsed this moment dozens of times, but now, in the low murmur of clinking glasses and polite laughter, it felt surreal. She waited until dessert had been ordered. Then, without ceremony, she reached into her bag and placed a small box in front of Jason. Inside was a flash drive and a folded envelope. She offered no toast, no speech, just a soft reminder: please watch this tonight. Then she stood, wished everyone a pleasant evening, and left the table. Her departure caused a ripple of confused glances, but she didn't look back. She walked through the chilly night air alone, the sound of her heels on the pavement steadier than her breathing. At home, she didn't cry or pace. She simply sat in the living room, lights dimmed, waiting. Not for a confrontation, but for a reckoning. It came just after midnight. Her phone buzzed with Jason's name. She answered without hesitation. His voice, usually even and calm, was strained and shaken. He had watched everything, heard the conversations, read the messages, listened to his mother's voice twisting truth into suspicion. The phrase that broke him had come midway through an audio file, Margaret speaking softly, smugly. "I gave him life. She wants to take it away from me. That girl thinks marriage gives her power. But Jason was mine long before she came along." There was silence on the line after that. Then finally, the words Claire had waited months to hear. They weren't grand or poetic, just quiet, trembling, and real. He was sorry. Not just for doubting her, but for allowing someone else to shape the narrative of their life. For the first time in what felt like forever, Claire believed he had finally seen it. Not just the manipulation, but the boundary that had never truly existed between him and his mother. That night, something shifted. The trap had been sprung, not out of malice, but out of necessity. And now, for the first time, the truth had nowhere left to hide. In the days that followed, the silence grew louder than any confrontation could have. Margaret responded to the revelations not with remorse, but with fury. She dismissed the recordings as taken out of context, accused Claire of betrayal, and insisted that her intentions had always been pure. The idea that someone would go to such lengths to deceive her son, this was, in her words, psychological warfare. She cast herself as the victim, the wounded mother undermined by an outsider. Her voice rang through family calls and messages, dripping with indignation. Some relatives took her side. They spoke of respect, tradition, loyalty. They questioned Claire's methods, her motives, even her mental stability. Others remained silent, avoiding both sides, hoping the tension would settle on its own. But the absence of support echoed just as sharply as the condemnation. The family, once a chorus of voices and shared dinners, fractured into uncomfortable distance. Jason watched it all unfold with a kind of stunned clarity. For weeks, he had felt torn, unsure of where to stand. But the recordings had shown him something he could no longer ignore: his own blindness. He saw now how his silence had been used, how his loyalty had become a tool for manipulation. The mask he had worn for years, the dutiful son, the peacekeeper, finally cracked. He called his mother once, not to fight, but to say goodbye. After that, he blocked her number. There were no more visits, no more late-night texts, just space. At first, the quiet in the house felt unnatural. Claire and Jason moved around each other gently, like people mourning an invisible death. The phone didn't ring. The doorbell didn't sound. There were no family dinners, no updates from relatives, no subtle reminders of someone else's presence in their marriage. The absence felt strange, almost wrong, like a limb had been severed. Even when the limb had been diseased, its removal left an ache. But gradually, the stillness shifted. The tension that had once lingered in every corner began to lift. There were small moments at first: a shared laugh over a forgotten inside joke, a spontaneous decision to cook something new, a quiet morning without interruption. Jason's voice softened. He listened more. He began to ask questions again, not about work or errands, but about Claire, about what she thought, what she wanted, what she dreamed of. Claire noticed the return of things she hadn't even realized were missing: the warmth in his eyes, the way he touched her shoulder in passing, the comfort of silence that no longer felt loaded. They began spending weekends outside, walking through parks, planting new herbs in the garden. It was as if, for the first time, they were meeting each other without anyone else in the room. No echoes of judgment, no invisible expectations. There were still moments of grief for what had been lost, for the family they had imagined, for the years shaped by someone else's narrative. But alongside that, grief bloomed something steadier: peace. They didn't need to speak of Margaret often. Her name faded from daily conversation, not by force, but by irrelevance. The space she once occupied had been reclaimed. And in that reclaimed space, Claire and Jason began to rebuild, not from ruin, but from truth, slowly, deliberately, and finally, together. 6 months later, Claire sat at her desk in the soft glow of a late winter afternoon. Snow fell outside in gentle spirals, covering the lawn, the fence, the roof of their home with quiet precision. The garden, now dormant, slept under a blanket of white, and the streets of Spokane hummed with that subdued calm that came only with deep cold. Inside, the house felt warmer than it ever had, not from heat, but from stillness, from ownership, from earned peace. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, the kind she reserved for letters she never intended to send. This one was to herself, not the version of her that now sat with steady hands and a rested heart, but the younger one, the girl she had been a year ago. The girl who smiled too much to hide how unsure she was, the woman who tiptoed through her own house, careful not to disturb the invisible weight of someone else's expectations. Claire wrote slowly, deliberately, like carving new lines into her life. She told that earlier version of herself what she now knew, that liberation didn't always come through confrontation. Sometimes it arrived through clarity, through the courage to strip away illusion and let truth stand, raw and unrehearsed. She admitted how hard it had been to let go of the idea of family she once clung to, a family defined by obligation, appearances, and silent obedience. That version had felt safe, but it was a safety built on denial. Real safety, she now understood, came from truth, even when it was inconvenient, especially then. She wrote of how love, real love, had to be chosen again, not just promised once, but reaffirmed in the face of pain, in the aftermath of rupture. Jason had done that. He hadn't come back with flowers or grand apologies. He had come back with presence, with quiet mornings, with attention. He asked about things that mattered. He listened without defensiveness. He held her hand not to possess her, but to say, "I'm still here." He had made space for her in a way he never had before, and she, in return, had softened, had forgiven, had stayed. By the time she finished the letter, the snow had thickened, covering even the footprints in the driveway. She folded the page neatly and tucked it into a book she kept hidden in her nightstand, an old poetry collection with pages warped by time. Just as she closed the drawer, she heard the soft footsteps behind her. Jason stood in the doorway, holding a small box. There was no speech, no choreography. He simply walked to her, knelt without flourish, and opened it. Inside lay a new ring, simple, elegant, unmistakably hers. It wasn't about a vow repeated, it was about a vow rewritten, not out of tradition, but intention. A new beginning carved from everything they had endured. Claire didn't cry. She smiled, quietly, fully. Then she looked out the window again. The sky had shifted to silver. Snow clung to the windowsill like lace, and for the first time in years, the view felt entirely her own. No shadows, no noise, just light, just breath, just the life they had finally chosen to build, together, on their own terms.